Okay, so an important policy hurdle that the Federal Reserve occasionally faces is what we call the lower bound on nominal interest rates. Now, that lower bound is simply 0%, right? So there's no way that I can take the interest rate below 0%. So just imagine for a second, if you got a loan that it said I have a negative 2% interest rate. So what that would imply is that I lend you money, say I give you $1,000, and then you have to give me back $1,000 in 1 year, but I'm going to pay you 2% interest. So I'm lending you the money, and I'm going to give you interest on top of that, right? So what that means, right, is that you could take out a loan for $1,000, just keep it, pay me back the $1,000 in 1 year, and then I'm going to give you 2% of that as interest, right? So I'm going to give you $20 at the end of the day. And so you did absolutely nothing. All you did was took out the loan, and you made $20 in taking out the loan, right? That would be a negative nominal interest rate. And since if that was true, basically everybody would take out loans, and the market wouldn't be able to be in equilibrium at that point. So that's a typical arbitrage argument, it's called. So I think we talked way back. This is way back when we were still in session, face-to-face. I talked about arbitrage in the foreign exchange market. So we were talking about buying Big Macs in the U.S. and taking them to Japan or vice versa, and benefiting from differences in purchasing power parity and exchange rates. That was an example of arbitrage. And the same is true in markets for bonds. So if the nominal interest rate on a bond goes negative, that would typically represent an arbitrage opportunity. And we tend to think that that can't happen to some extent. Although potentially maybe it can. So if you noticed recently, the interest rate on treasury bonds, the government's bonds, 3-month treasury securities, actually went negative for a period of time. So potentially it's possible, but that's a more advanced idea. And it doesn't hurt us really here to assume that the lower bound on nominal interest rates is 0%. For the federal funds market, that certainly is true. And so what happens then in the federal funds market, if I draw it out here, so here's 0% for the federal funds. Here's the quantity of reserves. And so the Fed can drop its interest rate all the way to 0, which it has done. So currently, right now, the nominal interest rate, the federal funds rate, is 0%, between 0 and 0.25%. So it fluctuates a little bit, but it's effectively 0%. And so notice what this means is that the Federal Reserve can increase the supply of reserves all at once. But since the interest rate can't go below 0, it's just going to stay there, right? We're increasing the quantity of reserves that are supplied, but banks simply don't want them, right? So the federal funds market, there's no change. The Fed is trying to buy stuff from banks, but there's no reason in particular to sell them at this point, and so we stay stuck at the lower bound. So the Federal Reserve can't do anything else right now with conventional policy. I want to decrease the target rate, but I can't. I hit the lower bound. So what can they do? They can do what we talked about with quantitative easing. And so to understand this is actually, more simple than what it sounds like. So we've gotten into a lot of details about the banking system, etc. But if you kind of remember, what was the goal of monetary policy? Was to decrease long-term interest rates. So the goal of monetary policy is to decrease long-term interest rates. And so the Federal Reserve is accomplishing that by decreasing the short-term interest rate, the federal funds rate, and then that percolates through the interest rate on longer-term lending. And ultimately, that increases consumption and investment and increases labor demand. That's the goal. So it could be that the Federal Reserve hits the zero lower bound. It still wants to increase labor demand. What do I do now? I can't decrease the nominal interest rate. Well, I can use quantitative easing, which is to buy longer-term assets, so 1 year or longer, from banks. I'm going to decrease the long-term interest rates in that sense directly. At least that is the goal, right? So imagine that a bank has a, let's just, to make it simple, let's say that they've extended a car loan for 5 years to a consumer. And the interest rate on that loan is 2%. So that's an asset for the bank, right? That's something that is owed to them. They own that asset. It's valuable. So what the Federal Reserve could do is to say, well, I'm going to buy that loan from you, right? So let's say the value of that loan is $22,000 with interest on the car. So the Federal Reserve can say, all right, bank, here's $22,000 in reserves, and I'll take your car loan, right? So I'm going to get the future stream of payments from that, and that is some value to me. Now, that's a longer-term asset that the Federal Reserve has bought directly. And so the more of those that the Federal Reserve starts buying, the lower the interest rate on those things tends to get. So the Fed is trying to decrease that long-term interest rate directly with quantitative easing by buying these longer-term assets directly, as opposed to indirectly with the federal funds rate. So when it hits the zero lower bound, it switches over to what we would call quantitative easing, which is buying longer-term assets. And the goal of that is exactly the same as the standard. Decrease long-term interest rates, increase consumption and investment, and therefore increase labor demand. So we saw the Fed do a lot of this in 2008 to 2015. So they were buying lots and lots of long-term assets, mortgages, long-term treasury securities from banks, and building up a huge amount of bank reserves in the banking system. And then they had been undoing that until we hit the recent patch of bad economic activity. And the Fed has been increasing reserves like crazy since then, in some ways in vehicles similar to quantitative easing, although it is a little bit different. So it's an interesting topic, a complicated one. But the main points you want to take out of this is that zero lower bound, federal funds rate can't go lower. Federal Reserve buys longer-term assets to decrease the longer-term interest rates directly with the same aim of increasing labor demand. All right. So that is the end of our discussion on monetary policy, and we will shift here into fiscal policy.